Welcome. I'm Jim Falk. The war in Ukraine, now in its third year, is apparently deadlocked, with neither Russia nor Ukraine able to land a knockout punch. In August, while Ukraine achieved a moral lift by successfully launching a surprise cross-border attack inside Russia territory in the Kursk region, Russia then responded by increasing rocket and drone attacks on the capital of Kyiv and other strategic areas, targeting key infrastructure facilities. Now, an impediment to negotiations is that the Biden administration and our European allies, most of whom happen to be NATO members, describe Russia as an existential threat. Polls, however, in both countries are showing that their respective populations want now to see an end of the hostilities and believe that negotiations should occur. Our two experts are among these voices. First, let me welcome Dr. George Beebe. He's the director of the Grand Strategy Program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and during his 2 decades of government service, he was director of the CIA's Russia analysis and staff advisor on Russian matters to Vice President Dick Cheney. He's the author of The Russia Trap: How Our Shadow War with Russia Could Spiral into Nuclear Catastrophe. Also joining us is Dr. Charles Kupchan. He's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a professor of international affairs at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. His most recent book is Isolationism: A History of America's Efforts to Shield Itself from the World. Among other key positions in government, he served as Senior Director for European Affairs at the National Security Council during the Obama administration, and he also worked in the Clinton administration. So as I mentioned, I think the date was August 4th. Ukraine did a pretty successful, at least by all accounts, surprise incursion into the Kursk region. I think a way to frame the question might be, was that a hinge point?
Well, I think it might yet prove to be a hinge point, but not in the way that I think the Ukrainians had intended when they launched this gambit. I think their hope was that they could successfully bait Russia into diverting forces from the front lines in Ukraine to defend the Russian homeland, and thereby contribute to their defense in the Donbass region. The Russians haven't really done that. They've diverted a few forces, but for the most part, they've kept up their assaults in the Donbass, and they've advanced, I think, at an accelerated pace relative to how fast they were moving prior to the Kursk invasion. And the Ukrainians now find themselves in a situation where they're in trouble in Kursk. Their supply lines are in danger, and their ability to defend themselves against Russian counterattacks, I think, is eroding over time. So we could ironically be in a situation where this gambit failed to achieve what it was intended to achieve, and in fact weakened Ukraine's defenses in the Donbass itself.
You know, just driving into our studio this morning, I heard that there was discussion again about whether or not the United States would permit Ukraine to use long-range missiles into Russian territory. And there are rumors that in the next few days that this will be approved. Dr. Kupchan, where do you stand on this?
Well, picking up on the question that you posed to George, that is to say, was Kursk an inflection point? I would agree with him and say no, and go beyond that to say there really isn't an inflection point in the offing. That is to say that even if the United States said to the Ukrainians, yes, you can use ATACMS or other long-range systems to hit into the Russian interior, it's not a game changer. Because the Russians, for example, have already moved the aircraft that they use to launch glide bombs more than 300 miles away, so that it'd be hard for the Ukrainians to hit them. And even if we give them more F-16s, even if we give them more Abrams tanks, I don't think there's a fundamental prospect of a shift on the battlefield. This is a war of attrition. It's a grinding war in which little territory is changing hands. To the degree it is changing hands, it's not to Ukraine's advantage. The Russians are chipping away at the front line in Donbass, trying to get to the borders of Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast. And so I think the idea that somehow the Ukrainians are going to win, as Secretary of State Tony Blinken put it during a recent visit to Kyiv, I don't see that. And as a consequence, I think we need to have a serious, honest, even if painful conversation for the Ukrainians about how this war and when this war ends, because I don't think time is on Ukraine's side. The Russia has a much bigger population and a military industrial base. I don't think that Ukraine can sustain these kinds of attacks forever. So everything else being equal, this is a war that needs to end at the diplomatic table, not on the battlefield, and we need to set the table to get there.
And I want to get to that in a few minutes about what a settlement might look like. But Dr. Beebe, give us a sense of just how much territory Russia now has occupied, and perhaps a different way to look at it is how much do they really control?
Well, I think the Russians control a little under 20% of the territory that was Ukraine when Ukraine left the Soviet Union back in 1991. Part of that is Crimea, which the Russians have annexed and controlled since 2014. But I think it's a mistake to look at this war as primarily about territory and to measure progress on either side's part in how much territory they might control. This is a war of attrition, as Charlie put it. And you don't measure progress in a war of attrition primarily by looking at the front lines in the battle. You look at other things. How many men can Ukraine train, equip, and send to the front lines to defend Ukraine against Russia? What's their inventory of tanks, air defense missiles, things like that? And when you judge by those measures, the Ukrainians are in trouble. The front lines haven't moved a lot, and they're probably not going to move a lot. The Russians are not going to conquer the bulk of Ukrainian territory. They're not capable of doing that. I think this war has shown that. But can they render Ukraine essentially dysfunctional? Can they precipitate a broader break of the Ukrainian state? That's within sight, and I agree very much with Charlie. Ukraine's fortunes for a prosperous future are eroding the longer this war goes on. So I think it's very much in America's interest, Europe's interest, and Ukraine's interest to try to bring this war to a negotiated end sooner rather than later.
And it seems like every day we're hearing about how Russia is hitting key strategic and infrastructure targets throughout the country, and now especially in Kyiv. You know, when you talk about who could be the winner, and for a minute, let's just think of it in sort of a military context. Just a few weeks ago, we had Kay Bailey Hutchison sitting right here next to me, and she was really framing this situation as Russia is an existential threat. We cannot let Russia win. And I'd like you all to listen to this clip. Why should we care about this?
It is in the U.S. security interest that we help Ukraine, because having been at NATO and seen, talked to people who know how Putin moves, know what he says domestically, he wants to recreate the mother Russia in the Soviet Union arena. And of course, he started with Georgia, and he then did Crimea, and then, of course, that disastrous entry into Ukraine. And the view of everyone that I really know and trust, he wants to go on to the next and the next and the next. And if he's allowed to do Ukraine, then it will be a NATO country. There's no question in my mind.
So, Dr. Kupchan, I'm going to ask both of you this question, but What do you think about what the former ambassador to NATO has to say?
Well, she's really articulating what we call the domino theory, that if you don't stop them here, then they're going to keep coming. That was the logic that got us into the Vietnam War. We know how that ended, not well. Do I think that Vladimir Putin is going to try this again somewhere else? Yes. Why? Because that's his brand. That's what he does. But will he try it against NATO? I think that's very unlikely, because he knows if he attacks a NATO country, he has just begun World War III. And he's having a hard enough time fighting Ukraine alone. I don't think he wants to fight Ukraine plus all of NATO. And I would also add that whether or not Putin tries this again, I don't think is a function of how the war in Ukraine ends. Whether it ends where it is today, whether they push him back further, he will try this again somewhere, because we know that that is how he legitimates his presidency, through this kind of twisted, dark version of Eurasian nationalism. But I think we have to be very careful about arguing that if we don't expel Russia from Ukraine, the sky will fall. That's a very dangerous way to make policy.
But when you say he was going to try this again, what countries are you thinking about?
In the soft underbelly of Russia's border areas, whether it's in Central Asia, whether it is in Armenia, whether it's in Azerbaijan, there I think he's going to try to stir up trouble and keep those countries in his sphere of influence. Do I think he's going to launch an invasion of Estonia? Absolutely not.
Dr. Beebe, how do you see it?
Well, I agree. The war demonstrates a couple of things so far. Number one, Putin does not want to tangle with NATO itself. He does not want a direct war with the NATO alliance, largely because the balance of power in a confrontation like that tilts strongly toward the West, toward NATO. Russia would really be in trouble, as I think we would as well, because that kind of conflict would quickly escalate to the nuclear level, and there would not be any winners in all of that. But the other thing is, Putin and Russia have had their hands full conquering Ukraine itself. They're not going to be able to take all the territory that Ukraine has. Ukraine's a very big country. The Russians have far too small a military invasion force to occupy and govern all of Ukrainian territory. So to imagine that a military that can't even conquer all of Ukraine would then move on and take on Poland, for example, with all of the NATO alliance behind it, I think is pretty far-fetched. The second thing I would say, though, is that what's ironic about this position, this view that the Russians will keep pushing as far as they can unless we stop them in Ukraine, is that it parallels Russian thinking about NATO and the United States. Their view in this war is, unless we stop NATO expansion now, unless we prevent it from moving into Ukraine, NATO will just keep pushing eastward into Russia, breaking up Russia. So there's a parallelism. I think both of those concepts are exaggerated. They're misperceptions. But we need to understand here that both sides, I think, suffer from those misperceptions. That's part of the reason why this dynamic is so dangerous, and why we could be headed toward a confrontation that neither side wants, and which would be deadly, I think, to both sides.
Now, we're at a situation where at the recent meeting of NATO summit in July of this year in Washington, there was continued talk about Ukraine becoming a member of NATO, which is still a red line for Putin. How are we going to get beyond this?
Well, in the spirit of full disclosure, I think NATO enlargement was a mistake from the get-go. And it was working in the U.S. government and the Clinton administration when this was cooked up, and had regrets about it at the time, because it didn't make sense to me to build a post-Cold War order that excluded Russia and that rolled NATO's border closer and closer to Russian territory. And to some extent, I think we're now seeing the results of a process of NATO enlargement that has been unstoppable. And I think it would be a mistake to include Ukraine in NATO. In many respects, the United States, from the beginning of the Russian invasion, has said we're not going to war with Russia over Ukraine. If that's the case, if we have deemed such a war inadvisable, it's not clear to me why we would then extend a security guarantee to Ukraine that would obligate us to go to war against Russia. I would say, however, that, and this gets us back to the previous question, Jim, I see Putin in different light after Ukraine than before. Before Ukraine, he took small risks, even though he was a risk taker. A bite out of Georgia, going into Libya, going into Syria. By invading Ukraine, I think he's demonstrated a recklessness that I personally did not see there before. And as a consequence, I think we need to arm Ukraine for the foreseeable future so that it can defend itself. I don't think, however, that we should extend an Article 5 security guarantee simply because that would obligate us to go to war.
Define for us the definition of military neutrality, because I've seen that could be an option. George?
Well, I think that applies to NATO in particular, to the membership in a military alliance. So this is similar to what Austria agreed to under the terms of the Austrian State Treaty from 1954, 1955, when there was a question as to whether Austria would be a member of the NATO alliance or a part of the Warsaw Pact. And the Soviet Union and the West agreed on Austria's neutrality. It would be a member of no military alliance. And I think that's what is a possibility for Ukraine moving forward. And I think Charlie's right. Ukraine needs measures for legitimate self-defense, and we've got to think this through. How do we create a situation in which Ukraine can defend itself, but is militarily neutral and is not laid vulnerable to some repeated Russian invasion? So that's a thorny problem. I do think it's something that is manageable in the course of a settlement.
So from a strategic standpoint, did it make sense to say that Ukraine eventually will become a member of NATO, and that's what the NATO countries members want, because then when you're in negotiations, you can step back from that. And both of you have written quite a bit about what a framework might look like. And Charlie, could you describe what you think is possible, what's achievable?
You know, I think that NATO felt a lot of pressure to take a new step toward membership at the recent summit here in Washington, D.C., and they came up with the phrase that membership for Ukraine is irreversible. I don't think that means a whole lot because membership requires unanimity, and at least for now, I don't think you're going to get every member of NATO to agree to let Ukraine in. And so for the foreseeable future, I think there are kind of two alternative pathways that we should pursue. One is Ukrainian membership in the European Union, and the EU has said it's going to move down that road. And the other is to turn Ukraine into a country that looks more like perhaps Sweden or Finland before they joined NATO, that is interoperable with NATO. Everyone knows that they align themselves with the West, even though they don't have the security guarantee. Or maybe another model might be Israel or Taiwan, where they're not technical allies of the United States, but we have their back and give them what they need to defend themselves.
What does President Putin have to have so that he can say, it made sense, we won?
Well, I think he has to some degree laid out his demands in his public statements about Russia's war aims. Certainly he talks about control of the 4 regions of Ukraine that Russia has formally annexed, but not, at least the 3 of them yet, militarily occupying control. He also talks about the demilitarization of Ukraine. In other words, making sure that Ukraine does not have the military wherewithal to threaten Russian security, either on its own or through basing American or NATO forces on its territory. And then he also talks about the quote unquote denazification of Ukraine, which I think is an ill-defined subject, but essentially comes down to wanting to ensure that Russian speakers living in Ukraine, people who are culturally Russian, are not treated as second-class citizens, and that's a squishy area. I think he's going to need something in all of those areas, but the biggest thing he's going to need is some assurance that Ukraine is not going to be part of the NATO alliance. I think the bottom line for him is that.
And that would be relatively easy for us to get to that point, I would assume.
Well, one would think in theory, but that is a politically fraught issue. And so the West has to manage a situation so that it's not perceived as caving into Russian demand.
Good point.
So that we manage domestic political friction over that issue. And we're not in a good position domestically to make that kind of concession. And we're going to need something in return from the Russians on that. We can't simply say, okay, we're going to agree to no NATO in Ukraine, no Ukraine in NATO, and not get something significant in return for the Russians.
But Charlie, how tight of a box does President Zelensky find himself in? Because he continues to say, and I understand why, it's to build enthusiasm and keep morale up, but we're going to get the provinces back, we're going to get Crimea, which I think everybody feels that they're definitely not going to get Crimea back.
I think if we had had this conversation a year ago, I would have said Zelensky doesn't have a lot of wiggle room because most of the Ukrainian population is behind him when he says we're going to win and restore territorial integrity. That's not where many Ukrainians are today. They're exhausted. They're seeing their sons go off to the front line. The country has lost about 50% of its electrical generation capability because Russia keeps pounding it. So public opinion is showing that somewhere around 50% of the Ukrainian population is ready for negotiations to try to end the war. Zelensky himself has talked about negotiations. Before the intervention in Kursk, there was a discussion going on with the Russians about opening a Black Sea shipping route. There had been a planned meeting in Doha, in Qatar, to try to reach an agreement between Ukraine and Russia about no targeting of civilian infrastructure. So I think we're edging toward a moment in which, politically speaking, in Ukraine, in the United States, in Europe, and probably ultimately in Russia, negotiations become politically palatable. We're not there yet. I don't think we're that far away from that point.
What difference do you see between the two candidates, former President Trump and Vice President Harris? And Dr. Kupchan, I'll go to you first.
Well, former President Trump has said that he'll end the war even before he takes back the Oval Office if he's reelected. I think he's being naive. It's going to be very, very hard to end the war. But I do think that he's right to say that we need to have a dialogue here and that this is a war that will end at the negotiating table and not on the battlefield. I'm guessing that regardless of who wins the election, whether it is Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, we're going to get to that point anyway. And that's simply because there'll be more political room for maneuver once Biden has left office. And also strategic reality has to settle in. And the bottom line here is we don't want to see this war go on for another decade. We don't want to run the risk that Ukraine turns into a failed state because Russia keeps pummeling it for the indefinite future. So I do think next year, after the next president takes office, we will see an effort to end the war, to get to a ceasefire, to begin a diplomatic process, regardless of who wins the upcoming November election.
What do you think, George?
I very much agree. The real question here is, can we generate the bipartisan support in this country that will be necessary to reach a settlement that protects our interests and protects Ukraine's independence and its future? Right now, we're in a situation where domestic politics make that a very difficult thing to do. So if we have a Harris regime, I think Republicans are going to have to not attempt to make political hay out of that, but actually support progress toward a settlement, and vice versa.
Well, I want to thank you both for being our guests today. You've certainly brought in important perspectives, and I'll say some that we often don't hear, so thank you both. The likelihood of Russia and Ukraine reaching any sort of agreement seems at this point unlikely, especially when we're waiting to see what happens in the election. Yet neither country is well positioned for a long, drawn-out conflict. And as we've heard, there are possibilities of a deal, but it is going to require compromises by both Russia and Ukraine. I want to thank all of you for being a part of our program, where we talk about things that matter with people who care.